I guess I've heard more just because I've been away, and so I think.
So we'll go ahead and get started. I apologize for the delay in getting things going, but everybody's here now, and we'll get started. My name is Steve Henrikson. I'm one of the members of the organizing committee for the Clan Conference, and I'd like to welcome you to the Growing Up in Sitka session. We have 5 panelists on the slate for this morning to talk about their life experiences in Sitka, and I'm very interested to learn more about what life was like here in the mid 20th century, the 30s, 40s, and 50s primarily, before and after World War II. As you all know, World War II brought quite a few changes to Sitka, and I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that. We do have, the panel has agreed to talk amongst themselves and also answer questions, and I'll be throwing out questions, but if anyone from the audience has questions too, that would be fine. I just need to make sure that they get the microphone so that the question is recorded. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you, Phil Donahue style, like he used to roam around in the audience. I don't know if you ever saw that, but anyway, I don't think there's anyone under 40 in this crowd, so I think everybody probably knows who Phil Donahue is.
I knew you reminded me of somebody.
So anyway, let me introduce the panel. We have some visitors from the lower 48 who grew up in Sitka. Roberta Charles, and then Linda Qualls, Lauretta King, and then, of course, Herb Didrikson and Gil Truitt are our panelists this morning. And I was hoping that each one of you would give us a little bit of background and just make any opening remarks that you might have to start out with. Bobby, would you mind starting?
Not at all.
Thank you.
I was born in Sitka in 1937. I was born in the village, past the old coal storage. Hi. And it's wonderful to be here and see old friends and family. And Steve's part of the family. And I see Johnny coming in the door. When I was born, the story goes that my grandmother was taking care of my mother as I was coming into the world, and her own mother, who was in the next room, and she was on her last hours in the world. And then I came into the world, and lo and behold, I came out the first towhead in the village. And there was a lot of concern, and my grandmother immediately went into the next room to tell my great-grandmother that I was born, and it was surprising to her, and she described how I looked. And Connie Clark said, "Oh, good. I've always wanted to have opportunities like a white woman. So give her my name, Connie Clark." And so that's how I got my name, Connie Clark. I was raised in my grandparents' home. I have memories of that. My grandmother, in particular, how she took care of my grandfather. She would put heat water on the stove, and they had a big tub, and I remember her heating the water and putting it in the tub, and then getting Grandpa into the tub, and she made sure he had his bath, and then when he got out, she got him all ready, and she would powder his face and comb his hair, and she took very good care of him. The love that was present between the two of them was quite outstanding. And during the early years, I would stand in his tool room where he did his artwork, his carving and silver. And of course I was always expected, not really told, but expected to be quiet and watch and observe. So for the first 4 years of my life, I stood there and watched him. And if I did happen to say anything, it was always answered by and by. Always. If I was a good girl, I got to go downstairs with him, and he would prepare me a cup of coffee, half coffee, half milk, laced with sugar, and then he would fix me a slice of bread, and he would put lard on it and sugar, and I was to take that piece of bread and dip it into the coffee, and that was my treat for behaving. And we lived there until, let's see, I remember when World War II ended, I remember asking Grandma what the bells were about. And she said the war was over. I'm going to stop here, but briefly mention, because of that little conversation I had with her. In later years, I was quite surprised to hear that my grandmother barely spoke English, if at all. And I do not know how we maintained that conversation, because today I don't speak Tlingit, but apparently at the time we did have conversations, and I had a lot of teaching from her about the Tlingit traditions. And I'm really thankful for that. And I'm also thankful, I want to point out what happened to my mother when I was born. This is one brief part I want to share with you, because I think it's important. They were going to make her leave the village because they thought she had done something outside of her marriage that created me. And my father's mother came to my grandmother and said, no, don't do that. Don't let them do that to her, because it was a mistake for me that I was with a Russian sailor. And that's how your father, my father, Nick, was half Russian and half Tlingit. And so my grandmother sacrificed her reputation to save my mother. And that was a lesson that I have learned and carried with me all my life, about how to sacrifice your own well-being for another human being. That was my first lesson, my first big lesson.
It's interesting because I remember when I was growing up in Sitka, and I left when I was very, very young, after my mother and father had separated and gone their separate ways. Well, they never really did go their separate ways, but our family pretty well was broken up by that time. But I do remember a saying that Hillary Clinton said, that it takes a village. It takes a village to raise your children, and that's exactly what happened to me. I have memories of the Waltons and the Lawrences and the Enlows and the Cascans all taking care of each other as children. I remember being on the beach, and I remember all the children being around, and we all protected each other and made sure we were all safe. So far as being Tlingit, I remember a few of the elders speaking in Tlingit, but the only time that I really realized that being, quote, Tlingit was listening to a gentleman on the radio when I was very young, and it was on Sunday, and he was doing the sermon in Tlingit, and I thought, man, that's really cool. So by the time my generation hit, the Tlingit language was pretty much not spoken at all. I had wished that I had grown up in this area so that I could have learned the language. And coming to these conferences and being around the elders, I've learned so much about being Tlingit. I wasn't just born into it. Now there's a culture that I am learning about, learning how to learn from my elders, which has been very eye-opening for me.
So you're your father is Nick Casacan.
Nick Casacan.
And Bobby's father
Right.
also. And grandfather Rudolph Walton.
That's right.
And your mother's name?
Rachel Walton Casacan.
She was, she's 10 years younger than I am, so she's my baby sister, and I have a lot of fun with her. We have a lot of good times together, as well as with my cousin Lauretta. And I remember that Janny's father made a wooden cart. It's one of my favorite memories, with big, huge, wide wheels, because we had gravel roads. And I would push her around everywhere. We would go out to the beaches. When she refers to all of us cousins taking care of one another, that was so true. We all knew where we lived, and we all were able to intermingle.
Yes, sir.
Great answer.
Greg Hope from Sitka, Alaska, and I just want to say that we have a panel up there, and none of them have identified themselves. So would you please identify yourselves?
Thank you.
If you could find a mic, it'd be even better. Shut up, Greg.
No, this is just for the. It's the mics are for the recording of this, and we're sorry we don't have a PA system set up in the room, but in case anyone did come in late, Roberta Charles, Linda Qualls, Lauretta King, Herb Didrikson, and Gil Truitt are our panelists this morning. And Loretta, would you like to say a few words to open things up?
Yes. So I'm, as he said, I'm Lauretta King, and my Tlingit name is Kajin. And I'm just learning more also about heritage and pronunciations, because we weren't totally immersed in the Tlingit ways in our early years. But some of my earliest memories are along like that Roberta was sharing, is of our grandfather, Rudolph Walton, and grandmother, Mary Charlie Walton. And it was such a rich heritage, because I was among the first of the cousins to be born that's present today, and that was in 1935. And so just even now in my lifespan, having reached 76 years, I can look out and see the tremendous growth that has taken place from Sitka, from the people, from the remembrance and the carrying forward of the culture and the language, and so many things that are just enriching. And of course, it's beyond the scope of this little session, but I know that my colleagues will share some of the things that were so instrumental in, as was said so many times through the conference, in helping us to realize who we are. And I think that was a sense that my grandpa Rudolph really passed on to me in those young years. It was so remarkable, because a lot of it was just by not complete sentences, but his example to us, his love when we would come into the room. I can remember his smell. It was so distinctive, because he chewed snuff, and then he had the smell of fish that had been drying, and moccasins that had been tanning, and food that had been prepared and put up. And he also smelled of his trade, which was in working with gold, and I have some of the things that he made and presented to my mother over the years, and the smell of the workshop. So he was a metal worker and a wood worker, and they were very distinctive smells. So as a youngster, they drilled into us, and Roberta and I were very close in age, and so we shared a lot of the same experiences in that first home that we can remember them in. And we would receive training, but didn't realize it was training until in retrospect. And there was the fact also for me, like Roberta mentioned, of not realizing that Grandma Mary didn't speak very much English, if anything. And yet I can really understand the things that she was teaching us, the things that she did for us, and I can even remember an ointment if we had any kind of a nick, because we were just 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. If we got a nick in our skin, there was an ointment that had sulfur in it and a very distinctive smell. And for a long time, I could remember the name of that ointment. But now in senior memory years, why that has kind of slipped from my grasp. And so there were things that were so particular. It was interesting to see in the research that the family has been doing, and a lot of thanks to Steve and his research and others. We had a picture of the house that Roberta was describing, and it was when it was first on the beach, and there were no fill-in of the area. It was where we remember the cold storage having been, but there was nothing around it. There was no dock behind it. There was a lot of foundation under it at that point in time. And we could see those pictures and how Grandpa and Grandma over the years had established later an addition. They had a restaurant there. Grandpa did his carving and work up in a little, like an off room from the upstairs. And I can remember that in looking into the room and experiencing it, he let us look at the little scales that he had. And I liked things miniature, and they were like miniature scales to me. And we would see those scales, and they were the ones for weighing gold for different things in the business that he was conducting. And so we could look, but we couldn't touch. And it was very drilled into. You could look, but you couldn't touch. And there were other things. They taught us to be careful. They taught us to be, I can remember Grandpa so many times saying, be good. He would tell us to be good. And then he would, to sort of reinforce it, he would give us a dime, put the dime into a piece of cloth, like a little piece of hanky. He would tie a knot in it, and then he would send us on our way. And Roberta and I, being real lovers of Cracker Jacks that was sold down at a store up the street, would take our dimes in the hanky, try to get the hanky open, couldn't undo it, and off to the store we would go to buy a box of Cracker Jacks. And so in later years, I found myself living in Israel for 15 years. And it was very unusual to be a Tlingit, among the Israelis, and I learned so many things from that. But among the things I really appreciated is when my cousins would send me boxes like we do to military that are off in different countries, and in that box would be Cracker Jacks and would be big hunk candy bars. So there were memories that were very dear, and I think in looking through the years, when I think about my father, our father, because my sister Nina is here with me today, Gunahin, there was such a feeling that I gained from contact with him. It's hard to express. It was such a feeling of love, such a feeling of being schooled without being lectured to, of being taught without have to sit down and write some things. And I just really learned a sense of appreciation for the things that he did in a very quiet way. And one of the things I'll share before I stop is just I can remember one time as a youngster going out on the boat, the Sea Ranger, the seiner that he had for years. And my future husband, Lynn, at that time we were just dating, was also a troller and on the boat with us, and he was kind of watching and observing. We made a run out through the bays, and we had some crew members with us. And my husband was the one that remarked on it. He said, I don't know how your father did it. He came by the galley where we were all sitting, he just looked at the crew member. The crew member excused himself, got out of the table, and went down and changed the oil in the engine room. Not a word said. It was something that they knew, one of those things to be done, and they did it. And so a lot of those things were by that example with, I'm sure we were like so many children receptive to body language, could understand our grandmother who was speaking Tlingit and we didn't understand, weren't raised with the language. So there were many things that contributed, I feel, to the I guess you would say, the destiny that some of my cousins and I found ourselves in, and that was in moving off into various parts of the world and sharing a lot of things about our knowledge and lots of things about Sitka and meeting and experiencing cultures, in my case, throughout the world. So I was able to meet people from so many indigenous backgrounds, learn their ways, learn the things that they were contributing, seeing what they did to preserve the unity amongst the people, and, as we're doing this weekend, the pride in carrying forward our culture.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to Herb Didrikson.
Yeah, my name is Robert Didrikson, Senior. Born here in Sitka. We had a house just beyond the community house there. It's a square house that sits alongside of it. That's where our house used to be. And the Russians buried a cannon just off of our property. And that's where the line was set, the Russians told us, you stay on your side and we'll stay on ours. So that was the first house of the village. And it ran all the way down to the cannon, Pyramid Packing Company. And the Littlefields, there are any here, that's where their house ended at the village. So we kind of grew up with fish, like as far as I can remember, when I was able to get around and walk the docks, we were free to do that. Going to school, our school was right next to on the property of our community house is where our government school was located. And remember, I was only about 80 feet away from the school, but the last bell would ring and I'd jump out of bed and run to class. But those are things that that I remembered. And then every day you got a teaspoonful of cod liver oil.
Yes, everybody knows that.
I was able to take that, when they gave us a cracker to go along with it. But that was our early life at the school. We even had a class in carving for our 5th, 6th graders on up. Mr. Pete Nielsen was our instructor. He sharpened my knife one time, and I was working on a little bear foot totem, and there was a knot on the nose, and I was really forcing down on that, and so fast I didn't even know I cut myself until we were walking up to the classroom. And one of the boys said, "Hey, your pants is getting all red, And here the sharp knife was pretty sharp. I didn't even feel it. But we had the nurse quarters was upstairs, so L.C. Bird's wife was our nurse there. And this is where a lot of our activities took place, up on the playground. We discovered there's a church. We didn't know what kind of church. It was a church for whites only. but we didn't see anybody go there because Sheldon Jackson had a Presbyterian church there, but they had a big choir, so it attracted everybody to go to Sheldon Jackson Church. And later on, this house was bought by Art Franklin, and he changed it into living quarters, where my wife and I did finally rent rooms from that when they fixed up that church for rental purposes. So we did a lot of playing on the beach. Beach was part of our playground, you know. Right in front of her grandpa's house there was a herring rock. It's kind of a famous rock there. It's kind of buried pretty much now. I think they cut a piece off just to know that there was a herring rock there. But that beach was a lot of our time spent making little boats and, you know, getting down close to the waters. Fishing, like I said, fishing was part of our life. The cold storage was, there's 6 buying stations on that cold storage. And my father and mother worked for L. Seaberg. He was a fish buyer. And we used to spend a lot of time especially when the halibut fishermen came in, because they were always so generous to give us little chicken halibut. You know, that always a pretty good meal. And it was too small to sell. And we'd go down there and ask for halibut. They'd always be nice enough to give us what we wanted. So one time they pulled a fast one on us. They saved one halibut for us. And after they offloaded, then he hollered down and said, "Well, send up that halibut for these kids. Here's a 300-pound halibut, you know." They didn't buy the real big ones. So, but he was wondering, how are we going to get it home, you know? Well, one of the guys says, "I got a wheelbarrow, you know." So, well, we need 2. And if you weren't careful, you know, that fish would slip out. We'd lose it. But we were able to get it onto the sidewalk, and from there, our house is up a little bit up on the hill. So there's no wheeling that fish up there. We had to tie a rope onto the head, and 5 of us kids dragging it up. And we got up. We had picket fence for my grandma, and we had to pull the pickets loose there, so we didn't want Grandma to see the fish. So we were able to put a board up there, and we all hauled it in and laid it out on the deck for her, and knocked on the door and told her, I said, "Well, your halibut's on the deck." And we went into the berry bushes to see her reaction. When she opened them, "Oh, my goodness." Well, here's this big halibut, and she started to get things ready, so we started cutting it up. She had them all cut up, so we had to feed the whole area, you know. All the houses around us had to get halibut. That is a good part of that big halibut that we drug up from the box stocks. The other thing was we made sure that we had to get some fish for the old ladies in the village, you know, that didn't have anybody. So we had to go get our best bamboo pole. It's about 12 foot long, with a big fish hook on the end. And then we walked up to Indian River. Indian River was quite a ways away. So on the way up, all the boats are there in front of SJ now, so that was a beautiful beach. Nice and sandy. There's low tide. And here some of the city guys were there hitting their golf ball, playing some golf on the beach. So and I don't know how I got a hold of a putter and a ball. I was practicing on the playground. And I hit one a little hard and went between two trees. And then I heard the glass. When I heard that, I ran. And then the guy's home, my dad worked for him. He knew where that golf ball came from, so my dad was short some money when he got paid. So he had to get his money out of that, for the broken glass that I started to get with him, and I said I could work it off. But working it off, I had to go down and cut halibut cheeks, and you couldn't get off the dock. I mean, you had your cheeks cut. There was always somebody there to buy it already. Not only that, king salmon cheeks, they're about that size. But those really go fast because the people really enjoyed that. So this is where, we took care of the ladies the old ladies in the village, made sure that they got their fish. A lot of the guys just enjoyed doing that because it meant you had to go out and get lots of humpies. But some of the ladies wanted dogs, and you had a hard time trying to catch those dog salmon in the river. But this is where, we had our share, maybe 6 or 7. It's all we could handle. And it takes 2 guys to carry it. You just kind of run through the gills. And you'd be walking, and the fish would be going down. We just take the beach road back home. And that took care of a lot of the village people that needed some help. We get back to our school on Christmas. There'd be party, they'd have plays. Have to take the music, then they'd have to hire some guys to take the piano down from the school down to the A&B hall. So a lot of our activity took place there at A&B hall. And this is a part that I enjoyed was during the school day, we had track meets up at SJ. We didn't know what that was all about, but we had 2 days off, and the teachers took us up there and observed all the athletes, And the ones that stuck in my mind was Louis Minard. He was a carver, and he was a runner. Mm-hmm. When I saw him prancing around on the deck there, he had a pair of pants on with slits cut up to the sides there, so he's really loose and he can run. So I watched the pole vaulters that performed there, and I thought, wow, that's great. So we had a bamboo pole. Some guy says, well, you use that bamboo pole, you better not let it hit the ground, So we had to figure a way to get over 6 feet, land, run and catch the pole before it hit the ground. So we got pretty good at that. But I was doing that about 6 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what it was. I didn't want anybody to see me in short pants, I guess. But growing up was really something. The part that I wished was I was a little bit Norwegian, you know, and the other half was Tlingit. But all the Tlingit families got 2 weeks off to go fishing. So they had their favorite places to go. And well, both my parents worked, so I didn't get to go on camps. You know, that's where they spend 2 weeks getting their fish for the winter. And that was really a time for young fellows to enjoy, you know, places that were named with all Tlingit names. So when I went fishing with her dad and Mr. Hope, well, they always mentioned these Tlingit names when we were passing in certain areas. But also Nick, he is one of the top fishermen around our country here. I don't think there's anybody that could do as well as he did.
Could I ask you a question about that? I recall Grandpa had a boat, the Bjorka, and during World War II they confiscated it.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, and they used it to patrol the area. And then when, I'm not sure, Dad couldn't go in the Army because he was a fisherman. He was exempt. He wanted to go.
Yeah.
And then when the war was over, I recall it being in the shipyard, and they renovated it back into a usable fishing boat. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You guys, both you and Gail are good friends of Dad's.
Right. But Mr. Yaw was part of that.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Yaw and Mr. Hope and George Howard. I think that's where the Princeton Hall was built, in George Howard's shop, because it was bigger. And well, the whole school student body was out to watch the christening of the boat. When that happened, well, as soon as the boat hit the water, well, the Navy came over and took it. You know, they confiscated the boat. And I'm sure that, Cyril George was probably one of those.
Yeah, he helped to build it,
Yeah, and Roy Bailey, I remember, was involved in that. But I was too young yet, so I got involved with the SGS second.
Yeah, that wasn't the only confiscation from the family at the time. Remember,
Yeah.
Bjorka Island was also given up freely for the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
Grandpa's position on that was one of a patriot.
Yeah. Well, there's another boat built after, I think it was in Mr. Hope's boat shop too. When they christened that boat, the Navy came over and took that, and the owner of that boat said, you're not taking this boat unless you take me with it. And they said, you're in the Navy now. But the SJS was something that, in my life, was a big part of my life. I was an Orthodox kid. I didn't know whether I could go to a Presbyterian school. They said, well, yeah, you have to pay $80 tuition to attend school. So, and the women were charged $60, I think. So I didn't have enough money. I fished on this really bum boat there at the time. They said you're going to get a share. I always thought share meant a lot of money. For the whole summer, I think the share came to under $20, but I got to learn a little bit about the fishing, and I got to eat, Sometimes it was so poor, we had to eat fish 3 times a day, and that was a big change when I got on to another. Mr. Yaw just told me to go get my gear and attended the school there. then October rolled around, and that's when fall fishing was. So we went up to, where's that bay up there? I asked about, what is that 10-foot wire fence? It's all lit up. And they said, well, that's German prison camp. And that was up just across from Buna. And I never heard of it, but I was in that area fishing anyway. So,
Is that excursion inlet?
yeah, there you go. But, yeah. Since fishing, this is something that we did. I worked in the cannery. I learned how to stitch boxes, thousands of boxes. And then I got graduated into what they call a salter boy. Make containers. We kept it full of salt because as the cans went by, they dropped a little automatic spoonful of salt. And then they got to be salt. The name escapes me now. It's, you know the difference between fish, puppies go here, dogs go there, sockeye, king salmon, and then fish counter, finally, that was the end. You're down on the boats counting fish. And that was so easy, you didn't have to really do anything. But that was one of the last things I did at a cannery before I went fishing. Then there's nothing like fishing, because you get to travel around and see different parts of the country. But all that, Truitt here, and a lot more of fishing in his area.
Well, I was born in a place in Sitka called the Cottages. And as I understand, we're supposed to make some introductory remarks and then get to when we were growing up in Sitka. So I will confine my remarks to the introductory part. And I was hoping these people would talk long enough so that 12 o'clock would come. And these three ladies in the program are listed as, well, their names are given. At the end it says, and others. Herb and I are always listed as others. Herb made a remark about a cannon. That was a very important cannon put in there by the Russians. Somehow that cannon wound up on the Mount Edgecombe campus. And the day the school closed, BIA was moving out. The city worked fast, but a truck came over to take that cannon back to this side. And I was still at the school as an administrator, and I put a stop to it. And I called Rocky Gutierrez, city manager, asked him about it. He said he didn't care. He said you could throw it in channels as far as he was concerned. But that was Rocky.
Yeah.
A good friend of ours.
Yeah.
Baseball.
And I should mention that in grade school, I ran every day hard and practiced because nobody could beat Herb in cross country. He never practiced. But when the meet came out, second, about 300 yards behind. And I went to Wrangell Institute and finally won a race because he was not there. And as we grew older into adulthood, in adult baseball, Herb played shortstop. I was second base on the Elks team. After work, we practiced every night hitting ground balls from about 6 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night. Never stopped. And I think because of that, we became pretty good baseball players. And we never talked, we just did it. Never told each other what to do.
Was Dad a catcher? I understand. My father, he was a catcher. My
Yeah,
father, Nick.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Years before we
City
played.
League, yeah.
And Herb mentioned going to school. He said 80 feet away. Well, I measured it because he was always late. And I measured it 73 feet. And he's telling me that his grandchildren were all complaining here in Sitka today about catching the buses. They didn't like it. Well, he got after them. So when he was in school, he had to walk all the way to the school building, 73 feet away. When we were in the latter years of grade school, I heard and other real good athletes talking about going to SJ or Wrangell Institute because that's where natives went. I didn't say anything because Herb mentioned it cost $60 or maybe $80, but we couldn't afford it. So my plan, well, no plan. I was not going to go on to school because there was no money. So the day before school started, I was up on the SJ campus. Herb and others arrived on campus with all their nice clothes. And I felt bad because I knew I was not going to go to SJ or go to school. So the next day when they were in school, I was walking by the campus, and a lady, a lot of us respect Miss Kuykendall, grabbed me by the arm and asked what I was doing. And I told her I'm going to the post office. She said, I want to know why you're not in school. So she pulled me up to the boys' door and said, you wait here, I'll be right back. About 5 minutes later, she came back and said, go home, get your things, you're going to go to school here. So that's how I wound up at Sheldon Jackson. I worked off that payment later. Then when I was going to go to Wrangell Institute, which is where I wanted to go in the first place, but I was still very poor and couldn't even afford the fare by plane. So the BIA principal looked for me, told me I was going to be going to Wrangell Institute to get on this plane. Years later, when Art Franklin died, that same principal told me it was Art Franklin who paid my fare. Some of you remember Art as being a very prominent businessman. And I heard other stories where he treated young people the same way. Now, when we were growing up, nobody ever had to tell us, respect your elders. We hear that a lot today, but I think a lot of times it's just empty words. Mm-hmm. When we were growing up, we respected older people, not just because they were older, but also people in authority, respectful people. You never gave them a bad time. You didn't talk back to them when they got after you. Now, some of the older people that I remember who were very influential when I was growing up was Andrew Hope. We all could talk a lot about Andrew Hope. Mark Jacob Sr. was another. William Walton, Harold Donnelly, Paul Edwards, and Peter Simpson. But these men I mentioned, I think Peter Simpson was the most prominent, the one with the biggest impact on a lot of young people, because he and Mark Jacobs took the time to talk to young people, little kids, sit down and visit and encourage them. And it was always get an education, go to college, get your degree. And Peter Simpson spoke against what today would be interpreted as anti-culture. But I don't look at it that way, because he was encouraging people, get that education, become a citizen. Those two things will be the key to our advancement. He also said it is time to drop the old ways. The new way is coming. And for us to make progress, we're going to have to fit in with the majority, because we're going to have to compete, or we're going to be left far behind. And a lot of times I see that to be true. But of the people that I think that had the older people had the biggest impact in what I was able to do, and I think was able to accomplish, were two dear people that we all remember, Florence and Harold Donnelly, who took a great deal of interest in young people and were always there to encourage the young people. Another was the Church of Christ minister, Bob Rowland. It was his doing, his recommendation, that I eventually went on to college and received a lot of encouragement from him. And I've already mentioned Art Franklin. Now people talked about their family. By the time I was 15 years of age, there was no one left in my family. Grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles on both sides of the family. And some of the members of the family were devastated, died tragically because of alcohol. And a lot of us experience hardship, which many people don't understand. A lot of times we're criticized because they say, well, you have nice home, you have good job. To give you an idea, in where I worked at Edgecombe for years, when we were critical about students because they weren't measuring up to our standards we set high, we were always told, well, you don't come from the same background as these kids. But I could remember being hungry many times, days in on end. Like Herb, we lived on fish. Subsistence saved a lot of us. I will end my introductory remark here, and I think they're have only about 20 minutes, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. Sure.
I'd like to mention a little bit about when we were playing baseball. We had some pretty darn good ball players that came to Sitka then. One played ball in Montana, and the other one in Los Angeles, you know. And these guys were probably the best ball players that hit Sitka at the time. And we have, remember Buck Everson. He says, I knew Joe DiMaggio before he could speak any English. So that's saying something. But, we learned a lot from those guys. Her dad was a catcher in the City League during the City League times, but he was also our coach when we started to play with the Sitka A&B organization. And their dad played center for us when we had our first championship team for Sitka A&B. So we're kind of all related here.
Yes, we are.
So I think that's great to bring that out.
I remember Janny's father when he was on the team, and he would come out onto the court, and all the girls would start yelling, "Muscles, muscles!" They thought he was so cute, and they just adored him. He was not very tall, but he was fast.
But my Tlingit name is Jim Coutin. Jim, hands, that's it. I had two old gentlemen, when I had a really good game against Ketchikan. I was stealing the ball and, getting a lot of rebounds. And these two old gentlemen, we used to see them at a ball game all the time. They never played basketball. When they beckoned me over to tell me they named you right. And so they called me Chief Seahands,
My husband is a member of the Lower Elwyn tribe just outside of Port Angeles, Washington. And he heard about Herbie, and he is Herbie's biggest fan, I swear, because he was so pleased that Herbie continued in sports for so many years. My husband will be 75 in May, and today he's in Idaho in a 50 and over basketball team tournament. So he really admired Herbie for playing ball and enjoying it and showing young people, what it means to be that person. Great role example throughout all of Alaska.
Yeah, we heard about the teams from up around Haines, you know, that all these Tlingit ball players would go up and Whitehorse and play up there. Some of those old gentlemen we knew, you know, their abilities, and they even played basketball. And one old fellow was 54 already, and here we were just coming around out of high school, you know, and he was a pretty good ball player at that. So a lot of abilities in sports came about.
I wanted to talk briefly about my mother because I remember her story about growing up and going to Sheldon Jackson. And she always told me about how by the time she was well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. When she was going to school at Sheldon Jackson, she said some of the things that they focused on for her was how to make a bed and how to sweep a floor and how to do some preparation for food and so forth. And it was limited in what the expectations were for her as a Tlingit woman. When she was a junior, she went to a guidance counselor and told the guidance counselor that she wanted to go on to college like these gentlemen did. And she was told that Tlingit women do not go to college. And so she got very upset and she quit school. And she was always so surprised that my dad had asked her to marry her because he was wanted by all the girls, according to my mother. And they got married. And I was born a year later. And her eagerness to go to college had a foundation from my grandfather, Rudolph Walter. And if anybody has a chance to ever look up Joyce Shale's dissertation, she did research about Rudolph Walter and about his relationship with Dr. Wilbur and how he learned to do so many things as far as becoming something other than a person who is not educated. The two of them became fast friends during a time when prejudice was still very high. And Dr. Wilbur learned things from my grandfather, and my grandfather learned things from Dr. Wilbur. And my grandfather he had a strong work ethic, but he used it differently in some ways. I recall him having stocks and utilities. He had his own native store uptown. He had the restaurant. My aunts and uncles talked about how the Japanese cook made certain sweet surprises for them. There was a bakery. Grandpa had, like Retta talked about, his own business, and he encouraged us toward education, all of us. And some of us did that successfully, but not through without a lot of heartache. For me, I think I told you when I was born in the village and I had blonde hair, I had difficulties. Even though my mom tells me and my grandma's told me, when I was 3 years old, I would go up to the elders and tug them on their skirt and say, "My name is Kanithka Clark." And my mother would say, I fooled my great-grandmother because she had always wanted to have the opportunities of a European woman. And I identified as Kanithka Clark. I really did not understand anything else. And nurture, nature, who knows? Lauretta's husband and my sister's husband, they are not native, and they both swear that we talk in code. And we heard the clan leaders talking about this morning and about the incomplete sentences. And we did that without speaking the language. But we did that anyway because that was part of our thinking process. That's somewhere along the line we learned and we don't fully understand. So my mother struggled, and as a lot of women did, and it was a hard time. I went to Sheldon Jackson for a semester, and I don't want to talk about my experiences there because they were not the best. I left there, and I was in Seattle, and I went to school there for a while. That also wasn't good because of prejudice. And eventually moved on and continued until 1963 when I was at what is called the Great Council Fire. And I learned about the Baha'i Faith. And one of the spiritual principles of the Baha'i Faith is education for everyone. Another one is independent investigation of truth. Those are only two of several of what the faith calls spiritual principles, and I took them to heart. And I investigated myself and said, is this what you can do? Can you forget about prejudice? Can you go into a school system? And eventually, I completed my doctoral studies at the University of Washington. But every step of the way, I felt that prejudice, not just as a Tlingit woman, but as a woman. And I would hear many of the professors talk about, the women professors talk about how they were not able to go up that educational ladder. They weren't recognized and they had struggles. So the blending of prejudice can be both about being female and about being Tlingit, and so it's complicated. It's not an easy issue. And and one reason why I don't want to go into it deeply here.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes left, and I was just wondering if, let's see, well, maybe did anyone else on the panel want to add anything before we take a question from the audience? Roberta?
Yes, I'd particularly like to just mention in having grown up in Sitka, having learned an appreciation for the culture and for the work that people did, and seeing activities like the bonding and the binding together that gold medal tourneys and basketball players did, and remembering about the work that my mother did, because she was a first grade teacher until her health failed, probably in a school not too far away from Herbie. And there were so many people that would come up to me during two events, actually three, and they'd say what an impact that my mother had on their lives, or my grandfather had on their lives, or my father had on their lives. I think that we just can't underestimate the importance of that role that's been mentioned a bit, that nurturing the youngsters, that helping to give them direction, that helping to carry them through a world now that is really can be so destructive so quickly, and to try and give them that protection to carry through. And what really instilled a feeling of pride, tremendous pride in me, was when, after being away for quite a number of years, I was able to come back to a conference that was held on the part of the Wilbur and the Walton families in 2000. And it was the coming together of these two extended families and saying, we were together at the end of the 1800s, and we saw a time go through where really our grandfather owed his life to the fact that Dr. Wilbur pulled him through pneumonia. And we came into existence because of that little incident. And so Dr. Wilbur, being a physician at the Sheldon Jackson School, really had this momentum. And after that many years, we had a celebration here commemorating those things, looking at them and saying it was because of their sacrifices, because of their interest in education, because of their encouragement, that we were able to come from having visited different parts of the world, come together and feel like a family still, and to move forward. It was very moving. There were a lot of cultural events that took place. The other one that had such an impact was the commemoration of the 100-year potlatch, because of course our grandparents were very involved in the 1904 potlatch at the obedience to the government at that point in time. And they said that, all right, out of respect for what the government is saying, we'll put these things aside. And after 100 years, in 2004, people, the leaders, were able to come together again. Regalia was brought, and I happened to be on a plane when pieces of headgear and other things were coming. And they were treated so preciously by the curators that were bringing them in. It was almost like they had suitcases chained to their wrists because they held these objects in such esteem. And they brought them back to Sitka and brought them back to the event. And one particularly that I remember is the return of the petrol hat after being away for many, many, many years. And the hat itself deserved a whole story of, things that we're doing today. And so events like this, it has such an impact on my life over a span of time. We want to be sure and have these things incorporated into the lives of our children. So 100 years from now, they're going to come and they'll say, remember when these people came and they talked about the things that happened before, so that they can carry on that sense of legacy with the changes that have to take place. The world is evolving. We're becoming one. We can hop across the world in probably about 20 hours. We need to know what other people are thinking. We need to know what their pain is. In that 2004 potlatch, one of the things that so impressed me was after having lived in Israel for 15 years, in the midst of a major conflict between half-brothers. One group of people belonged to one part of Abraham's family, another people belonged to a different wife from Abraham's family. And they cannot get along in that small country of Israel. It's in the news all the time. We see things happening in relationship to it. And when I saw that potlatch in the evening when they recognized the new leader, and everything had come to a very quiet point. The House leaders had been recognized, and the new leader came in, and everybody responded to this. And the new leader then got up and said, we want to resolve the differences that have come about because of our separation for that 100 years. We know that there have been hurts. We know that there have been things that haven't been carried out. And this was all given to me through a translator. And everybody was so quiet, so attentive, and said, we want to say that we recognize these things happen. We want to apologize. We want to come together and work and carry on into the future. Want to see how our arts will be. Want to see how our education will be. We want to see how all these different things that make us a people will be. And afterward, when I was thinking about this, I thought, oh my word, the Palestinians should have been here. The Israelis should have been here. They're working on conflict resolution. They're working on 100 years of it, where the others had been in enmity, for thousands of years. There should have been representatives from the United States here, seeing what was happening at such high-level dialogue, high-level consultation, high-level resolution of difficulties. And it occurred to me the United Nations should have representatives here. And that's the type of picture of things that are happening in Sitka and in other communities as these leaders come together, people come together to learn and to see how to resolve things, how to see to future education, how to move forward. And I think it has such a tremendous impact in the fact that I could be a part of it and see it happening in my lifetime and thinking about things that our father had said when he was nearing the end of his life and all the things that had happened in the span of his life, changes of the people, changes of the culture, changes of everything. And we saw it in a new place. And so if we can move forward 100 years from now with our vision that far down the road, and the world is small now, things that are happening here, we should be sharing with other tribes, other groups. The Maoris are working on it. Tribes in Americas that I was able to visit are working on it. We need to be able to move together and see about an excellent future for our children. And so it's something that I'm so appreciative of the opportunity for us to come together. And we have other Walton cousins that are sitting with us today. And to know that this is one part only of a family legacy that all of us have experienced. And each family has its story of its journey. And to share these things and to offer them to humanity.
Also, to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in August, we're having a family reunion in Port Angeles. We have 7 acres on the beach, and we're hoping to have everyone there. And we're going to take what we've learned here, previous conferences and so forth, and make sure our grandchildren share the legacy of our culture. That Jim Walton, when we had a family reunion before, instructed us to make sure that we carried on the family traditions and legacies. And it was this year we were thinking, we're getting to a certain age and we haven't really done this yet, and it's time. So we've decided August 10th, 11th, and 12 we'll do that.
Thank you. I wanted to, just in the few minutes we had left, I wanted to throw out kind of a all-encompassing kind of a question, and that has to do with knowing a little bit about your time growing up in Sitka, and when you were little, you experienced the efforts that were meant to do away with the old culture. You weren't allowed to speak your language in school and other things, and yet today we see the Clan Conference, and there's a lot of interest in reviving the old traditions or continuing to practice them. And I just wondered if, maybe Herb or Gil, from your experience, what do you think about this turnaround that's been happening over the years, where when you were first growing up it was kind of forbidden, but then now it's more accepted? What's your take on that?
Well, what you're saying no doubt occurred, but from the time I was going to grade school, we never heard the words "don't speak language." When I went to Sheldon Jackson, we never heard that. At Wrangell Institute, we never heard that. And being on the staff at Mount Edgecombe, it was never said. So I can't give you my experience in hearing that. But I do know older people who have made those comments that they did occur. And I also understand why those things came about, having studied these things in college, being a history major, and to also study those various laws that were passed by the United States Congress that led to some of these things I think the Clan Conference is now covering. But those laws were designed to further the progress of the Indian. And I won't get into details, but except one law, that was the Dawes Act, that was highly responsible for, and I think misinterpreted, that really that what we point to that says no language, no culture. But that law was intended to get the American Indian ready for citizenship that was coming in 1924. That law was passed in 1887. And that's one that talked about citizenship that would come. But it said you also had to do all of these other things to drop your language, drop your culture, drop your customs, to make the transition faster and easier. But that's what that law did, and I think really misinterpreted. But as far as hearing, don't speak your language, I never heard that. Matter of fact, growing up in the cottage, we never heard Tlingit being spoken. And over the years, I've always felt, well, that being a Presbyterian Sheldon Jackson settlement, all these years I've always felt that the people living out there probably got together and said there would be no Tlingit. We never heard it. And I always felt maybe if that's what they decided, it was to help us to grasp English. And I could remember going to school with Herb, where there were 3 or 4 boys who had a very difficult time with English. Mm-hmm. I don't think they got past the 2nd grade, and all of them died tragically and young. But I really can't address that hearing no Tlingit to be spoken.
So, but I recall that Herb said that when he was growing up, they actually had carving classes in the school. And when you were going to school, were there other kinds of classes actually offered in the school that had to do with Tlingit customs and traditions? Okay. Was the carving class, was that part of an ongoing thing, or was that just kind of a special?
Well, it might have been class offered by Peter Nielsen, but Boy Scouts.
Okay.
Their classes there, So.
But boat building, there was a lot of boat building.
Yeah.
I remember wondering.
Because my grandfather was Norwegian, we didn't. Nobody really spoke Tlingit. Mm-hmm. But my grandma did at times. But when she asked me to do something, I knew what she wanted. Mm-hmm. Not that I could speak it myself at the time, because we were over that hump, I think, and pretty much all English.
What kind of role did the clans play in those days? Were there clan-based activities, or any potlatching going on that you recall?
The period we're talking about is entirely different than today. We heard nothing about culture, period. At least where I grew up, I don't know about where Herb is. But we didn't see those things as we were growing up, because I think people were so busy trying to make a living. And things were tough when we were growing up, not just for us, but for adults.
During the
Our
Depression.
house was, I'm an Eagle, and I lived in the Brown Bear house. And we had people coming from Hoona, relatives. So whenever they came to town, we'd have to put them up, I mean, it was like their house, too. So I know they were questioning in the main hall there, who owns this house. But pretty much it was a clan house. And when they had, what they had on the back wall of our house was Tlingit, well, I forget now what was spelled out there, but it was a paddle that the tribe had, and it was mounted up there, and they just said, "Don't touch." And, we left that alone.
My dad.
I was wanting to know too another thing, whether they got a letter from Sitka during the herring egg season. Well, Bucket and I had gone out and they took a picture of our boat when we were going to lay some eggs, branches. But I was told, well, there's people in Israel and knows that you guys are going after herring eggs. So that might be true.
Might be.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll have to close it off here. We're at 12:06, and we're going into the lunch break now, and then we'll resume the sessions at 1:30. And if anyone is interested in seeing some photographs of some of the places that our panelists talked about today, one of the presentations in the archival session is on early photos of Sitka, and we'll be showing some scenes from what Sitka was like when these folks were growing up here. So I'd like to thank our panelists today. We sure appreciate hearing your reminiscences and